Democrats have introduced a bill that would make it a crime to be a conservative in the state of Washington. They are creating a domestic terrorist task force to go after any individual that holds different views other than their own.
Right-wing extremist groups and white supremacists and that kind of activity in Washington state specifically, yes.
Thank you.
This bill discusses combating disinformation and misinformation as if words are somehow violence.
Public safety requires free speech.
White supremacists and others are driven by conspiracy theories and manufactured fears around demographic change.
The January 6th attacks on Congress and the governor's mansion here in Olympia have dramatically shown the danger of domestic terrorism in the United States and Washington state at this time.
The study mentions white supremacy 9 times. There is no mention of Antifa or other extreme left-wing groups.
You will be labeled a domestic terrorist if you are anti-mask, anti-vaccine, anti-critical race theory, if you question the outcome of an election, and if you call out the LGBTQ community for their grooming behaviors, according to the examples that they provided.
We know that of the participants in the insurrection, about 23% of those were card-carrying members of extremist groups, right? But the rest of the folks who were participating were motivated by this big lie, right? By this election fraud narrative, and these bigger narratives and conspiracies are motivating extremist groups to action.
They say that these conspiratorial narratives motivate extremists. If you speak out against your school board, protest drag queen story hour events, question election officials, you will now be a domestic terrorist under Washington state law. It's House Bill 1333, and it must be stopped. To take action against this bill, it is crucial that you go to stopthecommission.com and sign the petition. Again, that is stopthecommission.com. Anyone can sign it. Do it now. Under House Bill 1333, Democrats will be establishing a domestic violent extremism commission. The duties of the commission are to combat disinformation and misinformation, address early signs of radicalization, and develop public health style responses. Now, this might look familiar. The Biden administration attempted to create a similar misinformation governance board, but it was ultimately disbanded for having the same characteristics as George Orwell's 1984 Ministry of Truth. And despite the national outcry, which caused the Ministry of Truth to fail, the state of Washington is now targeting their own citizens, except this bill is even worse. Now, these conspiratorial ideas are not actually conspiracies, but inconvenient facts when given the benefit of time.
In October of 2021, the NEA unjustly labeled peaceful parents across the country speaking in their children's defense at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. These parents were seeking the best interest of their children and were in no way being violent, and now here we are. Legalizing Orwellian actions such as data collection of citizens, establishing snitch lines for neighbors against neighbors, and sending people to re-education camps whose constitutionally protected speech those holding majority in power believe to be mis- or disinformation does not make these actions any more justified or moral. It makes them worse.
The committee will be working directly with the FBI and will be comprised of a representative of the governor's office, appointed by Governor Jay Inslee, and representatives from the Attorney General's office, Public Health, and the far-left Anti-Defamation League. They will also have 6 representatives that belong to a protected class, which includes the LGBTQ, Black, African, Muslim, Asian, Jewish, Latino, and Sikh communities.
This past year, I had a personal experience that under this proposed legislation could have caused me to be accused of domestic violent extremism. I was a swimmer at our community pool managed by the YMCA. One day after my swim, while naked in the shower, I saw a man in the women's dressing area watching and touching little girls. I asked for help from the Y staff to get him out of the area. Instead of helping me, the YMCA staff accused me of discrimination against this man and banned me from the pool for life. For weeks afterwards, a neoliberal version of the 50s McCarthy extremism took hold in this community, prompted by local churches in the city. The wording in this bill makes it feasible to charge women who speak up for the child safety, who believe they have civil rights to safety, privacy, and dignity in public accommodations, to be accused of domestic violence extremism. This legislation could open the door to charging women who speak up for safety and privacy in public accommodations to be declared domestic extremists.
While debating the bill during the committee hearing, Republican legislators slammed Democrats for unfairly targeting conservatives and turning a blind eye to the real terrorism threat in the Pacific Northwest, Antifa. During public testimony, both the Attorney General's office and the ADL made it clear that the bill is meant to only target what they claim to be right-wing extremism, as white supremacy is allegedly on the rise in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
Correct.
Absolutely.
All right.
These are looking at violent right-wing extremist groups and white supremacists and that kind of activity in Washington state specifically. Yes.
Thank you.
This bill discusses combating disinformation and misinformation as if words are somehow violence. This leads me to conclude that the committee wouldn't be so concerned with which words are supposedly violent, but rather who is speaking words that the chosen few disagree with.
Public safety requires free speech. This bill endorses state interventions that violate our inalienable rights and the Washington State Constitution and the United States First Amendment.
The Attorney General's 2022 domestic terrorism study states that the, quote, effective state interventions, end quote, that the work group wants this commission to find ways to implement have the, quote, potential to implicate speech or association that may be protected by the First Amendment or the individual right to bear arms protected by the Second Amendment, end quote. In short, the study acknowledges up front that their proposed state interventions are unconstitutional.
So if you're an American citizen that utilizes your constitutional rights to the First and Second Amendment, the state government can now label you a terrorist. They provided examples of domestic terrorist extremist networks, which include Patriot Prayer, a conservative Christian group, Watch State 3%, a conservative nonprofit, and the Proud Boys. But there's no mention of Antifa, who committed acts of terrorism for 6 months in 2020.
Something that is unique to Washington and to the Pacific Northwest on these well-connected extremist networks that we have. So we have the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, and the Washington State 3%ers are three distinct groups that elsewhere in the United States we don't necessarily see this kind of intense collaboration amongst groups.
And the form of HB 1333 is extremely one-sided in its purposes. I say this because the bill requires guidance by the recommendations in the Attorney General's domestic terrorism study. The study mentions white supremacy 9 times. There is no mention of Antifa or other extreme left-wing groups demonstrably responsible for the mayhem, riots, destructions, and murders in Portland, Seattle, and other major cities.
It doesn't matter if leftists riot, burn down businesses, attack police officers, participate in Seattle's deadly Chaz insurrection, and commit crimes with impunity. It only matters if you're an individual that holds conservative values.
The Washington State has a real opportunity to be a pioneer in this fight against global extremism, and I commend you for taking up this important work.
White supremacists and others are driven by conspiracy theories and manufactured fears around demographic change.
The January 6th attacks on Congress and the governor's mansion here in Olympia have dramatically shown the danger of domestic terrorism in the United States and Washington State at this time.
I'm a member of a group that is frequently discriminated against. I suffer the loss of opportunity. I'm excluded, and I have been a victim of intimidation simply because of my gender, my sexual preference, my ethnicity, and my religion. I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual man who's a Christian. And this proposed legislation makes me feel very unsafe. Being targeted simply because of my ethnicity makes me feel very uncomfortable.
This bill is broadly written with goals which are dangerously ambiguous. How can a committee form a framework to fight something without first clearly defining it?
Despite thousands of people testifying against the Domestic Terrorist Task Force, the bill was passed in the committee and will now be moving to the House floor. All Democrats on the committee voted in favor, while all Republicans voted against. And with a Democrat majority in both the House and the Senate, it is highly likely that this bill will pass if people don't take action. But this can be stopped, and it is crucial to go sign that petition at stopthecommission.com. Again, that is stopthecommission.com. Sign the petition, and if you dare question the communist regime, you will now be charged with domestic terrorism. I'm Katie Davis-Court for Rebel News. If you would like to support independent journalism, please go to rebelnewsusa.com and consider making a donation. We are 100% viewer funded, and it's how we stay uncorrupted. So again, that is rebelnewsusa.com. Thank you guys.